Muslims, it seems to me, are perhaps most conscious of global hegemony and the importance of resisting it. There's a reason for this. It's a Muslim land that has been invaded and occupied in 2001. It's a Muslim land that was invaded and occupied in 2003. And of course there is Palestine, which Muslims see as a land that has been occupied partly because of global hegemony, because of the support that Israel receives from the global hegemon. So it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, which have impinged upon the Muslim consciousness this notion of hegemony and why it is so important to resist hegemony. But Muslims are also conscious of the fact that they represent, in their view, a way of life that is different from what Western global hegemony represents. They believe that they embody certain values, certain principles, certain aspects of culture which are different from what the West expounds and practices. And for that reason, they don't want to be overwhelmed by hegemony. They don't want to lose their identity. Now the question is, how are Muslims resisting hegemony? There is one type of resistance which is known to a lot of people, and this is the resistance associated with groups like Al-Qaeda and other similar groups. That's the sort of resistance that the world knows about. It's resistance associated with violence, with the killing of innocent people at times. But there are different forms of violence, and we must be aware of it. There is the violence associated with Al-Qaeda, which are often described as senseless and mindless. But you also have the violence associated with resistance groups like Hamas, or the violence of the Hezbollah, which is much more sophisticated in a sense because they are very careful about targeting civilians. And at the same time, if you look at the ideological orientations of these different groups, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and Hezbollah, they're different from one another. In the case of Al-Qaeda, it is a very atavistic, regressive notion of Islam that Al-Qaeda practices. But Hamas is a little more open in its understanding and approach towards Islam. It holds on to certain orthodoxies at the same time, but is prepared to take into account the realities of the contemporary world. Now, Hezbollah is much more open than either Hamas or Al-Qaeda. They work with non-Muslim groups and they do not impose certain notions of Islamic law upon their followers. So there are differences amongst these groups that are committed to violence to some extent. But violence is not the only mode of resistance. And this again is something which has not been highlighted. One forgets, for instance, that in Iraq, there's been a great deal of non-violent resistance on a massive scale. There's non-violent resistance in Afghanistan. There is non-violent resistance on a daily basis in Palestine. In Berlin, for instance, people gather every week to protest in a peaceful manner against Israeli occupation. We have talked about modes of resistance, but to understand resistance to hegemony, one has also got to look at different expressions of resistance. There is a military dimension to resistance, which is why you find that some Muslim countries which are against hegemony want to strengthen their military capability. Iran is an example. And then you have political resistance to hegemony. And here again you have got Iran, which has been opposing hegemony on the political front. You have Syria, you have of course various Palestinian movements and other countries, including countries that vote against US dominance in the UN General Assembly, for instance, or mobilize public opinion on various issues. So there is also political resistance to hegemony. There is economic resistance to hegemony. You have Muslim countries which realize that continuing to use the dollar merely strengthens global hegemony. US helped global hegemony. Why? Because the dollar is a major pillar of US hegemony. And you have also countries that have talked for quite a long while about using oil as a weapon against hegemony. This has not really happened on a massive scale. It does not happen on a continuous scale. But don't forget that in 1973, in the midst of the Yom Kippur war between Israel and Arab states over the question of Palestine and related issues, Muslim countries attempted to use oil in a limited way, and they had limited success in trying to turn off the oil taps. This is when King Faisal was the monarch in Saudi Arabia. But since then, there's been no concerted attempt to mobilize the economic power, the potential economic power of Muslim countries in resisting hegemony. And one of the reasons why this has not been done is because a number of Muslim countries with economic clout are closely linked to Washington, like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait, like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman. A number of these countries are closely linked to Washington. This is why they can't use their economic potential to resist hegemony. Now, another dimension of resistance is cultural. You have a number of instances of Muslims expressing their own cultural identity as a way of resisting hegemony. The widespread use of the hijab is a good example of this. Don't forget that the hijab was first used as a political expression of resistance to hegemony in Iran during the 1979 Iranian Revolution against the Shah's type of westernization and against Western hegemony as they perceived it at that point in time. And there are, I suppose, other forms of cultural resistance, Iranian films, music, people trying to strengthen other dimensions of cultural expression. For instance, people sort of returning to what they see as a pure and pristine Islamic way of life in little communities here and there. These things are all expressions of resistance. There is an intellectual dimension to resistance, and that comes via ideas. In the midst of the global economic crisis, for instance, a lot of Muslims are talking about Islamic ideas on finance, on the economy, Islamic banking, Islamic financial instruments. These have also become ways of expressing resistance, and this is at the level of ideas. They've not been developed yet, but this is, I think, an area that is also very important. Now let me conclude by saying this, that there are various dimensions of Muslim resistance to hegemony. It's unfortunate that only violence has been highlighted because that captures the headlines. But what is of greater concern to me is something else. I think Muslims who are resisting hegemony have to go beyond their own community. Ideas which may emanate from the community have to be expressed in a much more universal, inclusive, and all-encompassing manner. Ideas linked to finance and the economy, for instance, should not be seen as Islamic ideas per se. They should be seen as ideas that serve humanity. Likewise, ideas connected with politics and ideas connected with culture, they should be seen as universal ideas. And in actual resistance, Muslims should also work with non-Muslim groups. Some of that has been happening. If you look at states, for instance, the level of governments, Iran has been working very closely with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Bolivia, and this is actually a new development. Now, it is that sort of cooperation between Muslims and people of other faiths that is very important. It is, I think, multi-faith resistance to hegemony which is really critical. And that is what Muslims should commit themselves to. Thank you very much.